Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar from Real Story Group. This is an exciting one for us today. It's our latest research and we'll be talking about personalization technology vendors, the latest offering that we're publishing, hard-hitting evaluations and critiques of the vendors in this space. So with us today is our company founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, along with our lead analyst in this space, Apoorv Durga. So they'll be taking you through the heart of today's presentation, but I'm going to kick things off with a couple quick housekeeping items of note and then a little bit of an intro to Real Story Group as I see a number of new folks on the line with us today. So for those of you who are attending today's session, you will be able to get a copy of the slides afterwards. That'll be emailed to you later this week from our marketing team, and the recording will be available on our website as well. We will have a couple of minutes at the end for questions. So if you have any questions or feedback or anecdotes you'd like to share, you can enter those into the questions tab and the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to those at the end of today's session. So as we get started, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about Real Story Group, how we got started as an organization. Tony founded this company 20 years ago along the lines of a Consumer Reports, where we'd never work for or advise the vendors we cover in any way. So you see some magical quadrants and waves that are out there, and the way we approach how we evaluate the vendors is a little bit different. We analyze them based on a number of use cases to help you determine what's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. So in that vein, we never work for or advise the vendors we cover. We don't speak at their conferences or write white papers for them. And if they subscribe to our research, that's great, but it doesn't mean that we're going to put any more favorable reviews about them within the research. So our main focus is on you as a technology user and buyer. In terms of the areas that we cover, we are completely focused on the MarTech stack, or the key anchor stores, if you will, of your MarTech mall. So you'll see here in our vendor map, we cover a number of areas like web content management, digital asset management, and customer data platforms. Today, we're going to focus on the brown line, which is personalization vendors. So you'll see that there in the middle of your screen, and you're welcome to download a copy of this map after today's presentation. But with that, I'll turn things over to Tony and Apoorv to get things started. Guys?
Great, thanks, Scott. This so-called brown line on the map in front of you, that's actually the newest line. And it's been very interesting, this kind of journey for us of really looking at personalization as a feature within some of these different, many of, if not all of these other lines, where personalization is really just a feature, to personalization becoming a kind of a platform, and you'll see in a bit a kind of a layer in your architecture going forward. And so there's been an evolution here that's going on, and part of what we're going to do is kind of trace that evolution, but then also give you some useful advice about how to approach this particular topic and how to evaluate personalization technology. So for the initial kind of two background segments, for the first 10 or 15 minutes or so, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Apoorv, who's first going to set the scene. And I think you knew this already, that personalization is hard. Omnichannel personalization is even harder. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, because that's going to then set the stage for how to look at this technology. So Apoorv, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony. I'm quite excited by this stream, personalization. So what I'll do is I'll set up some context around why personalization is hard, and then Tony will tell us about the new research, vendors, our vendor choices, and so on. Right. So personalization is a key component in a marketer's toolkit. We know that already, right? But to be fair, personalization is not really new, and we have had different flavors of personalization for a long time now. But with evolving usage of machine learning techniques, there is a renewed interest in implementing personalization. However, it is still extremely difficult to successfully implement personalization, even if you are a big company and have all the resources in the world. And these two screenshots will reinforce that. Now, this is especially true in context of omni-channel personalization or omni-channel customer experiences when your customers are interacting with you via several channels and several devices. So in next few slides, we'll discuss some of the reasons that make it hard to implement personalization. So this slide shows a sort of a stack that's common in organizations. We have all seen similar stacks. There are some statistics that say that an average organization uses about 90 different applications. But for the sake of this discussion, let's assume a subset of these categories. So in this stack, you have a subset of some of those applications. On top, you have the channels that you use to interact with your users, and then you have those interaction and delivery environments and your engagement management platforms and so on. Now these kind of stacks are not uncommon, right? Of course, the exact subset of these platforms will vary, but the broad idea is really similar. Now there are several problems with this sort of a stack or a stack model, but since today we are talking about personalization, let's start with that. So a common topic of discussion is, where should personalization live? Should it be part of WCM? Should it be part of email marketing? Should it be part of e-commerce? And the most common answer is that personalization lives everywhere, right? Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it does live at several places. So as an example, uh, consider the case of rules for personalizing content. So you have a set of personalization rules for your marketing automation or your email system. And then you have another set of personalization rules for your, let's say, content management system. And then you might still have another set of personalization rules as part of your e-commerce engine for product recommendations and so on. Now, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that there is no easy way to standardize or even align those rules everywhere. And so your delivery logic is now trapped in those individual delivery channels. As a result, your customers and prospects obviously don't enjoy an integrated, consistent experience. So let's look at that a bit deeper here in this slide. Right. So in this slide, you see the left box, which is called service and support. This service and support set of applications have their own content or or web content or email content or whatever. They have their own set of data or transactions or customer transactions, etc. They have their own set of rules for displaying that content. Similarly, service and support has its own planning and analytics. And same holds true for all the other applications that you see, right? So each of them have their own set of content, data, rules, planning, and analytics. So same thing goes true for each of these boxes. Now the result of this is that you have everything in a siloed environment, right? So every one of them is a silo in itself. And what that means is that each of these silos presents its own experience. So if you wanted to do something that is cross application, meaning, for example, using data in your WCM system to personalize your commerce experience, or doing something like that, it would not be really trivial. Now, in context of personalization, then what that means is that you need to think of newer architectures, or in other words, consider abstracting personalization away from these individual services or applications into a layer of its own. And Tony will speak more about that in a bit, but we'll come to that later. So 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 essentially, before we do that, let's look at the different ways of implementing personalization. It is hard to implement, but there are different approaches that we can look at. In particular, there are three approaches that we have seen amongst our customers. Uh, they are numbered 1, 2, 3 here. The first approach is implementing personalization as part of individual channels. The second approach is implementing personalization as part of data platforms. And the third approach is implementing personalization as a layer of its own. Now, we will look at what this axis means and what the color combinations and the sizes, etc., mean in a bit. But the point here is that there are multiple places to house your personalization engine, and there is no single right or wrong answer. You could obviously mix and match each of them, but there are pros and cons of each of these approaches. So let's look at the pros and cons of individual approach. The first one is part of an independent channel. That typically means that personalization is part of your channel or application, meaning it could be part of your WCM or it could be part of your mobile app, marketing automation system, or whatever. Right now, this is how personalization has been implemented traditionally, right? So there have been a number of web content management or portal systems that have offered some sort of rule-based personalization for a long time. Now, this approach offers the tightest integration with functionality because it is default, it is right there, right? But it also means that if you implement this sort of an approach, you would have to implement it for each channel or each application. So that is the biggest problem with this approach. And you often end up having multiple personalization systems or multiple personalization rules in this approach. The second approach is, like I said, being part of an omni-channel data platform, right? So meaning part of something like a customer data platform or a journey orchestration system, etc. Now, this approach basically allows you to abstract functionality away from channels and brings it closer to customer data, right? So if you have unified customer data, you can apply consistent personalization uh, algorithms or consistent personalization policies across different channels, right? But it also means that there is some weaker, the integration with channels is a bit weaker. So that's the trade-off here. The last option is implementing personalization as a dedicated personalization engine. So that's the third option we have. Now, this approach allows a cleaner architecture with separation of concerns, right? So a lot of large organizations have that as an overriding philosophy, right? So in that sense, it provides a much cleaner architecture. It also allows you to abstract that functionality away from channels, but it could be quite light in terms of integration with the channel itself. One major benefit of this approach is that the expanse of capabilities here is much more. So typically, dedicated personalization engines will provide you capabilities that are not part of the system when personalization is, let's say, provided by a WCM system, for example. So things like advanced experimentation or optimization and so on. So those are really the three approaches. So let's look at the summary of what we just discussed in the next slide. There are there, so there are three approaches that we just discussed: channel specific, data platform, and dedicated engine. They each have their own trade-offs as well as pros and cons. The two key trade-offs that we looked at, or the two key trade-offs that are very important, are ease of initial implementation, which is the x-axis here, and the quality of omni-channel experience. Now, being part of individual channel is easiest to implement, so it's on extreme right, but it's also not very good in terms of omni-channel experience because there is nothing like omni-channel there, right? It's part of each individual channel. The three approaches also differ in terms of some other parameters, such as the extent of capabilities. So a dedicated platform provides you a much more expansive set of capabilities that you wouldn't get if personalization were to be part of some other approach, right? So there are multiple approaches and different trade-offs there. Now, of course, all these three approaches are not really mutually exclusive, right? So we often see customers using a combination of all of these approaches. So for some tactical wins, you can use, or some tactical wins or tactical use cases, you might want to use a personalization as part of a channel, right? Whereas for longer term or more strategic use cases, you might end up using a dedicated platform. Now, there are several architectural and product choices possibilities there. And over to you, Tony, for telling us all about those platforms and our choices.
Yeah, thanks, Apoorv. I really like this graphic on the left because it shows a maturity kind of journey there, but it also shows a marketplace journey, like how the marketplace has evolved, where CDPs have started to embed some personalization capabilities, and then we've seen the rise of dedicated engines. How independent they are definitely varies, but I think that's what prompted us, based on our subscriber input, to actually create this new personalization stream to address this personalization engines kind of head on. You know, what works about them, what doesn't, what are their pros and cons. And I think you've done a great job of kind of setting up the table architecturally from the standpoint of it's yet another service that probably needs to be decoupled going forward from your engagement platforms. And so architecturally, that's how we look at it as well from a stack perspective. So Apoorv set up, this silo problem where I've got personalization logic baked into all these different silos. And that's not a unique problem, the silo problem. We also have it with respect to data, content, analytics, and any number of things where we have too many important enterprise services that are trapped within individual silos rather than being enterprise-wide. And so many of you have seen our answer to this, which is part descriptive and part prescriptive. And it's what we call the reference architecture model for the 2020s, which is the kind of omnichannel CX stack, where you still have the engagement channels at the top, the interaction delivery environments, content and engagement management platforms, but then you have what we describe as enterprise foundation platforms. These are capabilities or services that really need to be decoupled so that you can apply them across your different customer experiences. And the most recent box here that we've added is the brown box, which we put in bold, which is personalization technology, for customizing individual experiences. And so that's, what we're going to be talking about today in the context of really Apoorv's third model as an independent layer. Now, to be sure, that personalization capabilities may be embedded within a journey orchestration engine, maybe within a customer data platform. These boxes are really around services and not necessarily vendors. So ideally, you don't have two vendors in the same box, but you may have a vendor that spans multiple boxes here, right? This is a services architecture, but this is a reference framework for you to think about, and certainly it guides our research agenda and our advice when those of you who are subscribers call us up on the phone or ask us for advice around your stack. This is kind of a reference model that we deploy. In a sense, though, you could think of all this as these foundation platforms as a personalization sort of stack in a way, because there's a lot of dependencies when it comes to personalization. Yes, it's a layer, but it's also very heavily dependent on potentially the other services within your enterprise foundation tier. So the personalization platform in Brown may provide services for recommendations, A/B testing, optimization, segment, or even individual specific experiences, all very important stuff, everything we're trying to do. But it may rely on some lower level decisioning engines that potentially are part of a broader journey orchestration regime. Certainly is going to be heavily dependent on unified customer data in orange. Certainly going to be very dependent on having omnichannel content capabilities, in other words, content fragments and variants that can be swapped in and out, and obviously some advanced operations that are needed, and therefore operational hub technology to actually manage these sorts of omnichannel experiences and the personalization logic that goes across them, and the sequencing and prioritization and frequency capping and everything else. So, personalization in itself, although we're looking at it in isolation, obviously none of us have the luxury of deploying it in isolation. It's heavily related to a certain degree of maturity that you need in some of these other segments as well. Certainly, we consider getting your customer data house in order as kind of table stakes for this. In other words, if you're trying to execute on personalization without your customer data operation being very mature, you're unlikely to be very successful. As a practical matter, in that brown box, a number of vendors have emerged. These are the ones that we evaluate now. We're going to be adding some more independent players based on your feedback around who are some of the critical vendors that you're testing or that you've relied on or that you're wondering about going forward. Some of the MarTech suite vendors had a little bit of a leg up here because they had already built in some personalization capabilities into their platforms. Adobe, of course, has Adobe Target. IBM had built some personalization that Acoustic inherited. Salesforce has acquired personalization. Optimizely was acquired from Episerver. Kibo has acquired some. Oracle acquired some. So there's a number of vendors that used to be independent that were acquired by some of the major MarTech suite vendors. The short story that you'll hear very frequently from us is you always need to be a little bit careful about MarTech suite vendors who purport to sell you an independent layer. In other words, they tend not to be particularly good at these enterprise foundation platforms because their outlook tends to be very parochial around personalizing or managing, supplying foundation platform services to their own environments as opposed to across your full diverse stack. So there's a little bit of note of caution that I'll put in there about the personalization capabilities that you get from our tech suite vendors. There's a number of other independent players, many of them though very, very small, not all necessarily mature from a large enterprise customer perspective, but we'll be adding more to our research over the course of the next several quarters. Of course, this begs the question, how do you evaluate and then select vendors? So this will be the last part of our discussion here. I wanted to just remind you that if you had any questions or concerns, anything you disagreed with, anything you wanted to agree with, a vignette you wanted to share, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll definitely have time to address that towards the end here. So if you know Real Story Group, you know we literally wrote the book on selecting technology using an agile methodology. You can see in the windowsill behind me the right way to select technology. It's about applying design thinking and agile principles to what was heretofore typically very waterfall and therefore somewhat non-optimal ways of selecting technology, and you want to apply a filtration process where there may be multiple different vendors that you want to look at, but then you want to go through a definition, ideation, prototyping, and test phase to really get down to the vendor that's the best fit for you. And so definitely encourage that with respect to personalization, where we've worked with some of you around developing these user stories and actually testing them, and testing these vendors can be, I'll say, exceptionally eye-opening. And it really revolves around business cases and use cases, and so that's what you should do when you're evaluating vendors. And by the way, this is what we do when we're evaluating vendors. So the four that we came out of the gate with personalization, these are the rows that you see on the left, are test and optimize, web personalization, outbound personalization, which is like email and other messaging, and then e-commerce recommendations. And not every vendor is going to support all these use cases very effectively. And so this is, I'm not putting the vendor names in here, I just have A, B, C, D, E. But these are 5 personalization vendors and how we've evaluated them against these use cases. We have a decision support tool called Real Quadrant that allows you to emphasize which scenarios are important to you, and then it generates, based on this data, an actual quadrant for you. And this is what this comes from. And so this is the way that we evaluate vendors, and clearly this is the way you should evaluate vendors, whether you subscribe to our research and advisory services or not. David had a quick question, which is, what do the numbers mean next to these? And these are really the number of vendors that you might be looking at. So in the typical market that we cover, there can be as many as 36 vendors. Personalization, maybe more of a dozen. And then you want to define, get down to 6 to 8 vendors, and then ideally invite only 4 in for demos, and then prototype via bake-off with 2, and then optionally do a POC with 1 vendor. So David, the numbers here mean the number of vendors that you're looking at. But again, this is from our Real Quadrant tool. Those of you who are subscribers can play with this, input your own requirements and data, and then get a lot of analysis back, of course, backed by a lot of data and research from underneath the covers. Here's an example. We just took the Oracle Maximizer product, very heavily oriented towards test and optimize, and also outbound personalization. However, here's again where the Harvey balls don't necessarily tell the whole story. With respect to outbound personalization and web personalization, very tightly bound to other engagement platforms within the Oracle stack. So that's one of the key things that you need to consider about Oracle, Adobe, Microsoft, Salesforce, and others, is the extent to which their personalization capabilities allow you to personalize other platforms within their suite, but not necessarily provide truly omnichannel personalization with respect to integrating with all of your other almost always diverse set of incumbent platforms. So we'll end where we began, and I know some questions have come in. Certainly welcome others along the way. This is the MarTech stack. You saw a couple different ways. You saw the actual stack, and then this is the actual vendor map. And so for those of you looking For support in this area, there's 3 ways that Real Story Group can help you. One is what I mentioned, the Real Quadrant, where you get access to all of the hard-hitting research and different decision support tools to help you get down to a short list and to help you understand not just the strengths, but the weaknesses of the different products. And so you can do that on a subway line by subway line basis. Some of our subscribers just subscribe to personalization or just to web content and experience management. The second offering we have is the full stack advisory, where you get access to all of our research across all of these different subway lines. You can travel anywhere on this map, but also we advise you about stack decisions more generally. And a very common conversation we've been having over the last year, and especially within the last 6 months, is where should personalization fit in my stack? And it's not as simple a question as you might think. And so we've been really engaging a number of our subscribers on those lines. And then the third offering we have is that we have a MarTech Stack Leadership Council that provides private meetings where we get together and exchange peer-to-peer advice and recommendations. And we're actually having our next 5th council meeting tomorrow. We're going to be talking about a number of issues around data and a new world for data. So excited about that. So if any of these 3 are of interest, please do follow up with my colleague Scott. And so he'll tell you exactly how to do that. Meantime, Apoorv and I will take a look at the questions and come back to you in a minute.
So, Tony, there are a couple of questions that I noted. The
first one is, so let's just see. Hey, Apoorv, can we just have Scott kind of wrap up here real quick?
Okay.
And then we'll get to the questions. Thanks.
Great, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. And again, as Tony mentioned, you're welcome to reach out to us anytime at explore@realstorygroup.com if you want to take a look at a behind-the-scenes tour of that Real Quadrant application he showed you to get to a short list of vendors. And also, when it comes to the Stack Leadership Council that Tony mentioned, we are meeting tomorrow. But if you're interested in attending our next session, which will be in September, let's chat over the next couple of weeks. We can talk to you about the last few meetings we've had, who's on the council, and what that would entail for you. So always welcoming conversations with potential new members of our MarTech Stack Leadership Council. The next webinar is going to be on June 23rd, so next Thursday, about the right way to select a new web content management platform. So hope you can attend that. And with that, I'll turn things back over to you, gentlemen, for the questions.
Great. Thanks. So Apoorv, you were saying.
Yeah, so I think there is this question. I think this relates to the logo landscape, right? So do these products offer rule-based personalization or AI-based personalization, and should we prefer one over the other?
Aha. Okay, you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. So I think at least the products mentioned in the logo landscape and the ones that we have covered, most of them do provide rules-based personalization as well as machine learning-based personalization. We don't call it AI-based, we call it machine learning-based, but essentially the idea is same. Now we have seen that rule-based personalization works very well if you have, let's say, 5 rules or 6 rules and maybe 10 attributes, right? But as the number of rules start increasing and the number of attributes start increasing, it's not very uncommon to see like thousands of attributes these days, right? So when you have those many number of attributes and hundreds of rules, I think it becomes unmanageable to use a rules-based personalization. So that just doesn't scale up. And therefore, if you have those kind of requirements, machine learning-based personalization is certainly preferred over rules-based personalization.
Right. Yeah. For sure. I think managing these things become the issue. Managing on day 1 versus day 365 are 2 different things. So we do have some other questions that came in. The first one from James is omnichannel versus individual channels, which is, given that the heritage of many personalization engines is in site personalization, he's referencing Target, Monetate, and Evergage, site personalization. Do they have any limitations with personalizing access across all marketing, sales, and service channels? Are there any limitations there, Apoorv?
Well, so I think it's a spectrum, right? So almost all of them have some sweet spot, right? So some are good at site personalization, some are good at A/B testing, some are good at optimization, etc. So all of them come from a different background, and all of them do try to provide personalization across all these. Now, the extent of omni-channel experience, which is why that was a parameter in our slide, right? So that of course varies, right? So there is no straight answer to that, I know, but the fact is that it's a spectrum, and all of them try to do it in varying ways.
Yeah, and it feels like there's a spectrum of intimacy there, James. That said, well, how are you going to personalize that email? A very interesting question. Do I have to ingest all of the content and do it within the personalization engine? Is it happening at assembly time? What can I personalize? There's a lot of devils in those details, and really developing use cases is the key thing. But I think you're hearing some skepticism from Apoorv there that's well taken based on our experience. Let's see. Here's a really good question from Mark. Personalization comes in different forms, like displaying different image or content snippet, a name or token amongst text, or different links or pages. Can a separate personalization service handle all of these different types across multiple channels? So the idea is, if I have various content types or widgets or components, some of which may be more image-based, some could be video, can a separate personalization service handle that diversity of content variants?
Yeah, so if you recall Tony's slide on the personalization stack, there was an omni-channel content platform there. So essentially, personalization systems or personalization servers cannot do it all alone. They often work in conjunction with other systems such as omni-channel content platforms, or so-called headless content platforms, or content marketing platforms, or platforms of that nature. And then you combine those two or more platforms to be able to do exactly this. So personalization servers on their own cannot do all of this. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the personalization engine can definitely supply the logic and may not care what the content is. But I think where what becomes interesting is Apoorv's mentioned, which is how do you manage? For many organizations, this is the first time they've really been managing component content at this level of complexity, and this notion of having sibling variants is really unusual for a lot of content management systems. And so the content management infrastructure underneath this starts to become really, really important. So great question, Mark. Tracy also has an excellent question, Apoorv, and I'll mention it here, and then we'll go back to that slide. Tracy's asking, what is the tipping point for companies to move up the personalization maturity curve? In other words, what's the tipping point from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 on your curve here, which I'll try to go back to?
Well, so I actually think that there may not be a tipping point always. I see a lot of customers using multiple of those approaches, right? So for some things that they need really quickly, or some things where they don't really need an omni-channel experience, they often end up using the channel specific approach. But for cases where they need a better omni-channel experience across all the channels, they end up using the third approach, right? So it is very hard to say what is the tipping point, but to summarize, I think it would be fair to say that for short-term things, the channel-specific approach really works better, and for things that are really long-term or strategic, I think it makes sense to go for second or third approach.
Yeah, I think you make a great point that it's difficult to completely commit one way or another, because even in the organizations where we've seen them license a dedicated engine, they're still doing bits and bobs in the other two. So there's no purity, there's no pure architecture anywhere, for better or worse. I think we have seen some tipping points from channel specific where it just became too painful and customers were having just radically different experiences, and so that pushed you up the maturity level, get you closer to the data perhaps. With respect to the data platform, many CDPs and others have somewhat simplistic personalization engines, and they tend to be stronger on, allowing you to micro-target relative to this rich data that they have, maybe not so strong in terms of the transparency and the manageability of the rules and the logic, and the impersonation and preview and simulation and some of the other things that you would see in a personalization engine. Okay, well, we've run 5 or 6 minutes late, so appreciate everyone's time for hanging out with us. It's a topic we could probably and maybe should probably schedule more time on in the future, but wanted to thank everyone on behalf of my colleagues Apoorv and Scott for joining us today. And like I say, you'll get, like Scott mentioned, you'll get a copy of the deck, but otherwise, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Scott, and we'll take it from there. So in the meantime, it was great spending this half hour plus with you, and we'll see you next time. For Real Story Group, so long now.
Bye. Thank you.